What if everything you think you know about Queen Elizabeth I's death is a lie? For 45 years, she ruled England with an iron fist wrapped in silk gloves. The Virgin Queen, the woman who crushed the Spanish Armada, outwitted kings and popes, and transformed a vulnerable island nation into a global power. But in March of 1603, inside Richmond Palace, something happened that powerful people have spent centuries trying to bury. The official story: she died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by loyal servants. The reality: eyewitnesses gave conflicting accounts, key documents vanished, and some of the people who were there later changed their stories. By 1600, Elizabeth was 67 years old, aged, exhausted, and tormented by chronic pain, insomnia, tooth decay, failing eyesight, swollen joints. Some suspected cancer, others, madness. She refused to lie down. For days, she stood silently in her chambers, unmoving, unblinking. Courtiers begged her to rest. She refused, over and over again. Then suddenly, she collapsed. She was taken to bed. She never rose again. What happened next? We're not sure, because records go blank. Doctor's notes, missing, court transcripts, edited. Some effects from her chambers were never catalogued and never seen again. Elizabeth never named a successor aloud. The Virgin Queen, the mother of a nation, died childless and possibly confused. Some say she refused to hand over her ring of state. Others say it had to be taken by force, while her body was still warm. Robert Cecil, her chief advisor, had already begun secret talks with King James of Scotland. Did he know the Queen was dying before she did, or did someone make sure she died when the time was right? Lady Scrope, one of her closest attendants, claimed Elizabeth accepted her death with calm grace. Years later, she changed her story. She said the Queen was barely coherent and didn't recognize anyone in the room. Dr. Edward Dotting claimed he treated her. His journal, lost to history. They gave her a queen's funeral. They sealed her tomb, and they sealed the truth. Because England couldn't afford scandal. They needed a smooth transition to King James, and they needed Elizabeth to die a myth, not a tragedy. Did Queen Elizabeth I die peacefully, or was her end manipulated, silenced, erased? The records don't say, but if you listen closely, you might hear whispers from Richmond Palace, still echoing after 400 years. The death of Elizabeth I, history's greatest cover-up, admitting weakness. For Elizabeth Tudor, that would have been the same as signing her own death warrant. So she created the most elaborate deception in royal history. Every morning, her ladies-in-waiting spent hours applying a mask to her face, a thick paste of white lead and vinegar, painted on layer by layer. The mixture was toxic, but necessary. It concealed the deep pockmarks left by smallpox scars that had ravaged her skin decades earlier. Beneath that porcelain mask, the Queen was decaying. Her teeth, rotten black from years of sugar addiction. She rarely smiled in public, and when she did, it was with her lips tightly pressed together. During audiences, she'd tilt her face just right, keeping courtiers from seeing too much. And the wigs. Oh, the wigs. Elizabeth owned more than 80 of them, each one bigger, redder, and more elaborate than the last. Why? Because by her 60s, the Queen was almost completely bald. At court, they whispered, her hair hadn't fallen from age, but from lead poisoning. The same white makeup that preserved her image was also slowly killing her. But here's where it gets strange. Toward the end, she began talking to her portraits. Not metaphorically, literally. She would hold conversations with paintings of herself as if they were old friends, advisors, even replacements. Was it grief, madness, or a queen trying desperately to hold on to a version of herself the world still worshipped? Even as the real Elizabeth began to disappear, what the world saw was Gloriana, the eternal Virgin Queen. But what the mirror showed was a dying woman, poisoned by her own image. She was speaking to herself. Servants claimed they found her at 3 a.m. standing before a portrait from her coronation, asking it for advice, as if the young woman in the painting still held the answers she'd lost. Her hands shook so violently, she could no longer sign documents without help. But in public, she maintained the illusion of strength. Every gesture, rehearsed. Every appearance, staged. She wore gloves at all times, now not for fashion, but because her fingernails had turned black, frighteningly dark, almost dead-looking. Medical records from the time, sanitized. The truth buried by 1602. By then, her inner circle was running what we'd now call a psychological operation. They controlled who saw her, when, and under what lighting conditions. The Virgin Queen had become a carefully maintained illusion, but the cracks were beginning to show. Elizabeth's refusal to name an heir. For decades, it had been political genius, but now, it was a deadly gamble. Foreign kings, ambitious nobles, even her own parliament. Everyone was kept guessing. Would she marry? Would she adopt? Would she finally point to someone and say, "You're next"? The ambiguity gave her power, but by 1603, that power was unraveling. Behind palace doors, the vultures were circling. Robert Cecil, her most trusted minister, was secretly corresponding with James VI of Scotland. Supporters of the executed Earl of Essex still whispered about alternative candidates. Catholic nobles saw a rare opening, a chance to restore their faith to the throne, and Elizabeth, she knew exactly what was happening, and some say she enjoyed it. To the French ambassador, she reportedly said, "I may not be here next Christmas, but England will survive the chaos, not peace, not stability, chaos." She knew her death would trigger a succession crisis, and part of her relishing the drama let it. The Spanish mobilized troops in the Netherlands, ready to support a Catholic claimant on the Scottish border. James prepared for anything, peaceful coronation or armed conflict. A message from James: "I await only the Queen's death." Elizabeth Tudor's final gift to England, uncertainty. And as her own heart slowed, the heartbeat of an empire hung in the balance. By early 1603, England was on the brink, not of war abroad, but of collapse from within. In London, merchants were hoarding gold, preparing for civil war. Uncertainty hung like smoke in the air. Behind palace walls, Queen Elizabeth's most trusted advisors were no longer just advising. They were running a shadow government. They forged her signature. They intercepted letters. They quietly eliminated those who might pose a threat to the transition of power, all while pretending to serve a queen who was losing touch with reality. By 1603, England was no longer being ruled by Elizabeth Tudor, it was being managed by a small group of men desperate to keep the kingdom from exploding the moment she drew her last breath. And the Queen's behavior, it grew strange. So strange that some at court began to whisper about demonic possession. She refused to lie down in bed. Instead, she stood against pillows propped against the wall. "If I lie down, I shall never rise again." Servants reported finding her in the middle of the night, eyes wide open, speaking to people who weren't there. The portrait obsession worsened. She began rearranging paintings of herself almost daily. Some, she said, were watching her wrong. Others were judging her choices. SFX, page flip, inventory list narrator VO, A 1602. Inventory recorded her personal portraits were moved 47 times in a single month. She wasn't just managing her image, she was battling it. Elizabeth had always been a light eater, but now, she refused food entirely not from illness, but fear. She would only eat food prepared by one specific cook. And even then, every dish had to be tasted first by someone she suspected of disloyalty. Cut 2. Nobleman reluctantly biting into piece of meat. Sweating, she began hoarding small objects, buttons, coins, scraps of silk, tucking them into secret places like a magpie. She would sit for hours, staring at her hands, claiming she could see the marks of time crawling across them like shadows. Then came the midnight wanderings. Guards found her in the palace gardens at 2 a.m., barefoot, dressed in nothing but her nightgown, mumbling about something she had lost. Guard, she said she was looking for her younger self, or for the place she left her happiness. The breaking point came in February, 1603. During a routine court session, Elizabeth suddenly stood up and began dancing alone, to music only she could hear. For 20 minutes, the most powerful monarch in the world twirled and spun, lost inside her own mind. History crowned her glorina, but behind the crown, the Queen was already gone. Europe swayed. Elizabeth spun. And her horrified court watched in silence when she finally stopped. She looked around confused, disoriented. Elizabeth, why is everyone staring at me? From that moment on, her inner circle initiated what they called the management protocols, which meant one thing: the Queen was no longer ruling, she was being supervised. On March 10, 1603, Elizabeth was moved to Richmond Palace. Everyone knew what it meant. It wasn't retirement. It was the final performance. The official account of her final days reads like a carefully edited script, because that's exactly what it was. Robert Cecil claimed the Queen spent her last days in quiet prayer and gentle conversations with trusted aides. A graceful decline, peaceful, dignified, a monarch ready for death. But in a private letter, Lady Scrope, one of Elizabeth's closest attendants, told a very different story. She raged against the dying of the light. She spoke to those no one else could see. The so-called peaceful ending begins to crack when you compare the witness accounts. On March 18, she reportedly pointed to her throat and said, "I am not well." Her first admission of illness in months. But then, the stories fracture. Cecil claimed her last words were, "All my possessions." For a moment of time, Lady Scrope wrote that it was something far simpler: "I wish not to live any longer." And a third courtier swore she said nothing at all, not a single word. The death scene itself. It has more plot holes than a bad stage play. Who was really present? When did she lose consciousness? Why were key observers never allowed to speak publicly? History remembers a queen who slipped away quietly, surrounded by dignity and candlelight. But behind the curtain, the truth may be something far more tragic. Or far more manipulated. The Queen is dead, but the myth lives on. The Queen, supposedly, died at 3 a.m. on March 24, but the official announcement wasn't made until nearly 11 a.m. 8 long hours of silence. During those 8 hours, Richmond Palace was in complete lockdown. No one entered, no one left, except for a secret group of 6. Only these 6 had access to the Queen's chambers. Only these 6 touched her body. Her body was immediately moved and prepared for burial. No independent physician examined her. No autopsy was performed. An astonishing breach of royal protocol, and unheard of for a monarch's death. The official cause of death: old age and melancholy. A diagnosis that isn't even a diagnosis. But the detail that should make your skin crawl: in the morning of the 24th, servants found the Queen's chamber windows wide open. She had ordered them sealed tight weeks earlier, terrified of the night air. Yet someone had opened those windows after she died. The most damning piece of evidence: a letter from the Spanish ambassador, dated just 3 days after her death. What did it say? What was the secret they buried with the Queen? Before Elizabeth's official death, the Spanish ambassador wrote, mentioning recent developments in the English succession. How did he know something was about to happen? Before it even officially happened, Elizabeth's final act wasn't a peaceful death. It was a carefully orchestrated cover-up, one that began before she even drew her last breath. Within hours of the Queen's death, the most efficient historical sanitization campaign in English history was underway. The masterminds, the very people who supposedly loved her most, were in control. By noon, Robert Cecil had dispatched rioters and couriers to Scotland, bearing the news of James VI's succession. Documents that had clearly been prepared weeks in advance. But here's the smoking gun. Those same documents included details of Elizabeth's final wishes, details no one else had witnessed. The first wave of evidence tampering began immediately. Elizabeth's personal physician, Dr. John Dee, was quietly removed from the scene. What did he know? What truths did he carry away, silenced before they could be told? Dr. John Dee, Elizabeth's personal physician, was found dead in his chambers just 3 days after the Queen. Official cause: heart failure. A convenient timing for a man who had been quietly documenting the Queen's mysterious symptoms for months. Lady Scrope, the same woman who wrote those damning letters about Elizabeth's final days, suddenly recanted. Her revised testimony, submitted to the Privy Council, painted a completely different picture, one that aligned perfectly with Robert Cecil's official narrative. What changed her mind? Her family's crushing debts were suddenly forgiven. Her son received a lucrative court appointment. The price of silence. The most brazen cover-up: Elizabeth's private chambers. Within a week of her death, the entire space was gutted and renovated. Tapestries, furniture, personal items, all destroyed or relocated. When questioned, Cecil claimed it was standard royal transition protocol. But palace records show no such protocol existed for previous monarchs. Several key witnesses simply vanished from the historical record. Sir Thomas Heneage, present during Elizabeth's final weeks, disappeared from court documents after March 1603. His estate was quietly absorbed by the crown. His family never spoke of him again. The official death announcement, when analyzed by modern historians, contains anachronisms and impossibilities. It describes events that couldn't have happened in the sequence it claims. The story the world was told was carefully scripted, but the truth, it was buried deep. Along with the Queen. The official death announcement was full of holes. It included quotes from people who weren't even there, and referenced conversations that directly contradicted other documents. But Cecil's masterstroke was the funeral itself. The most elaborate royal funeral in English history, a procession lasting hours, a spectacle that cost a fortune. By turning public attention toward celebration, he shifted focus away from uncomfortable questions about what really happened at Richmond Palace. The cover-up worked so well, it took historians over 400 years to start noticing the inconsistencies. So what really killed Elizabeth? Theories that emerge beneath the official story are far more disturbing than simple. Old age. One theory: mercury poisoning. Elizabeth's white face paint contained deadly levels of mercury and lead. Analysis of similar cosmetics from the period shows they cause exactly the symptoms. Elizabeth exhibited tremors, paranoia, insomnia, and eventual neurological breakdown. Her blackened fingernails, the classic sign of mercury poisoning. The whispered conversations with her portraits. Mercury poisoning can cause hallucinations and paranoia. The Queen's final days, a tragic tale of power, poison, and deception. Hallucinations induced by mercury poisoning. But some historians whisper of something darker. In 1999, during renovations at Richmond Palace, a hidden chamber was uncovered beneath Elizabeth's former rooms. Inside, bottles containing traces of arsenic, antimony, and other poisons. The discovery was quickly classified and removed from public access. Why hide 400-year-old bottles unless they revealed something explosive? Theory 2 gets even darker: assisted suicide. Several coded letters exchanged between Cecil and his associates, discovered in the 1980s but ignored by most historians, reference ending her suffering and a merciful conclusion. Facing complete mental collapse, and fully aware of the chaos her death would ignite, Elizabeth may have chosen her own exit. The most disturbing theory involves religious extremists within her own court. Her Protestant reforms created powerful enemies. A faction led by radical Puritans may have hastened her demise. To install a more religiously compliant monarch, the mysterious 8-hour gap between her death and the public announcement. Time to stage the scene and eliminate evidence. And here's the chilling detail. The window to her chamber, sealed weeks before, was found wide open that morning. Someone had tampered with the scene. After the Queen was gone, the truth about Elizabeth's final days, locked away in poison, secrets, and shadows. Elizabeth's death keeps historians awake at night. Her body showed signs of rapid decomposition, a decay too swift to be natural. This isn't consistent with old age, but consistent with poisons known to Renaissance assassins. The Spanish ambassador's prescient letter grows darker still. He wasn't just predicting Elizabeth's death. He described precise details of how the succession would unfold. Only foreign intelligence could have known. Foreign powers knew the plan before it happened. A conspiracy so vast, so well executed. If Elizabeth, Europe's most powerful monarch, could be eliminated so efficiently and quietly, who else in history suffered the same fate? Her death wasn't just the end of an era. It was a masterclass in how to murder a queen and get away with it.